Hi, and welcome back to Glassboxed, writing automated protractor tests. Today we're going to have a look at writing page objects when writing protractor tests. We will look at what the page object pattern is, how to use page objects in a protractor test, and the advantages we get by writing page objects. So, what is the page object pattern? Well, before we understand what the page object pattern is, let's navigate to our Java test site first. So on this page we have various things. We have text, we have input fields, we have links, we have buttons. So if you were to say describe this page to someone, you would most likely say this page has what looks like a table, i.e. all of this, and inside this table we have some text which are larger than other text, some text which is bold compared to other text. We have an input field, we have a button, we have links, we have colors on the page, and so on. So this idea of describing a page is no different to what the page object pattern is. So let's just say when we were writing an automated test and we want to say click on this button, or we want to grab this text here, or we want to insert some text here. As we're writing stuff in here and this dynamic text is generated, let's just say we want to write code to grab this text as well. All of these features or all of these web elements are tied to this one specific web page. And what does that mean? So that means that this continue button is only available on this particular page. This field and this dynamic text, this link, all of this text, everything you see on this page is strictly related to this particular page. So let's just say we wanted to write a class, some kind of code that contains all of this information of this page. That is referred to as a page element. So what does a page element actually do? So a page element is quite simply just an element on a page. So if we were to break it down, you could say if I want this text here, what I would need to do is go to the class which is representing this page and find the method that will return me this piece of code. Or let's just say we want to grab this button. What I would do is go to this page object, which would be a representation of this page, and find the code that says the continue button and then call that method. So we'll probably build understanding of what the page object pattern is a little bit more as we go through today's video tutorial. But for the moment, the important thing to understand is that a page object is a representation of a web page, and the methods which are contained inside a page object are used to get information off the web page that the page object is representing. So now that we've kind of briefly discussed what a page object is, we're going to automate a scenario and we're going to use page objects to do that. So the first thing we have is this index page, and we have text in the index page. So the first thing we're going to do is just randomly type in some text, something like something like this. Once we've typed in the text, we're also going to grab the text, then we're going to go ahead and click the continue button, and then we will come to this animal selection page. We're going to select an animal, doesn't really matter, any will do, and then we're going to click continue, and then when we're on the thank you page, we're going to check to see that this thank you page actually exists. So I have already written a really basic test that doesn't use page objects, just to get the ball rolling. So we have this really basic test. What it does is, as we've already seen, it will go in the home page, i.e. the index page, as part of the before each method, and then we will type in this text, and we will then get the text, and then we will do an expect on it to make sure that the text we get is the same text as the text we type in. Once we've done this expect, we're going to click on the continue button. When we're on the next page, we're going to select the second value from the drop down box, and I'm doing this by getting the model and then using the CSS invoker on it, and we're going to click the continue button, and finally we're going to get the text of the thank you, which is again by CSS using the h1 tag, and then we're going to just assert to make sure that is the correct text. So before we go in forward, let's actually run this test just to make sure it works. So to do this, I'm going to have to run WebDriver Manager first. And let me put that to a side. And then I'm going to run this code. So this code is now in my C drive. And if I now run the comp file, this should now run this test. And that's it. So it was relatively quite quick. So now what we're going to do is translate this test into a page object test. So if we go back to our home page, the first thing we're going to go ahead and do is actually write a page object to represent this home page. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to create a new file and I'm going to save it first. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new folder and I'm going to call it page, and inside this I'm going to create a new JavaScript and I'm going to call it home_page.js, and I'm going to save it as an all type file just to ensure it saves as a JavaScript file, and save that. Now before we go into forward, let me show you the directory quickly. So I've created a new dev folder in my C directory. Inside that, Protractor, and inside that I've got 3 folders: a conf to contain the configuration, a page which will contain the page objects, and a test which contains the test. So if I show you the conf first really quickly. So all the conf is doing is basically pointing to the test directory and picking up any test inside that. So that's pretty straightforward. So the conf file runs this test, which in turn will now start picking up our page objects once we start writing them. So let's go ahead and actually write our first page object. So to write a page object, what do we do? Well, the first thing we do is, because it's a JavaScript, in that it's not closely tied to other languages such as Java or C# or C++. When we write objects, we represent objects as functions in a JavaScript file. So that's what we do. So the first thing we're going to do is declare a new function, and we're going to assign the result of the function to a home page variable. So I'm going to say var home_page, and I'm going to say that is equal to function, and the next thing I want to do is make sure that I am able to export this page as a home page. And to do that, all you do is say models.export as a new home page. So what this means is I have declared a new function, and this function will be assigned to this value here, the home page value. And if I were to export this file, or rather import this file somewhere else, the import would be the result of this function that's returned in this variable, which is then returned as a new instance. So now we're going to go ahead and actually start writing methods inside this page object. So the first thing we said we want is enter some value into this field. So let's quickly inspect this field to see if there's anything we can use. So this field has a model called person.name, so we can use that to identify it. Now when you write methods in JavaScript, in particular page objects, the way you write them is you first use the this identifier to basically say this is the function that I'm acting on, and then give it some value. So I'm going to say enter field value, and this is now equal to a new function, and in this function we're going to say that I want to be able to locate an element by model, and the name of the model was person.name, and what I want to do is be able to send some key values to it. So before we move on, let's quickly look at what we've actually done. So what we're saying is the entire page is basically a function which is returned here, and the method we have inside this function is also a function. So what we're saying is methods in this object class are actually acting as functions which return something. So in this case, we're not returning anything. We're trying to submit the value, or we're trying to submit a value inside this input field. So the next question is, how do we actually pass in information into this function to be able to pass in information via send keys? Well, that's quite straightforward actually. What we do is we pass in the value in the function. So let's just say value here, and then we can use that inside send keys. This will now take whatever value we pass in and use the send keys method to pass in whatever value we pass in into this particular field. Right, so the next thing we said we'd do is get the text that's generated as a result of entering text into this text field. So we're going to do the same thing. We're going to say this dot, let's just say get dynamic text is equal to function, and this time we're going to return something. So we're going to say return element by, and let's find out what is generated. So let's just say test, and let's inspect this to see if there's anything we can use. So this has a bind class, again with the same value, person.name. So we can say by binding person.name dot get text. This function will now return the value of the text that's set at that point in time, whatever it happens to be. And to access this function, we will use this identifier, i.e. get dynamic text. And the final thing we want to be able to do on this particular page is click on this continue button. So I don't need to even look at the source code because I know there's a method called button text. The only thing I need to understand is what text is inside this button, and I can see that it says continue. So that's the only thing I need to be concerned about really. So I can say this dot, let's just say click continue is equal to function, and here we are going to say element by button text, and it was continue dot click. Right, and let's just leave it at that for the moment. So what I now need to do is actually use this page object in my test. But really quickly, what's happening here? Well, through the explanation of these two functions, this should be very self-explanatory. But what is happening here is, again, we're calling a function, and inside this function, i.e. when we call this method, all we're basically doing is clicking on the button by identifying it by button text. Right, so now let's go ahead and actually use this inside our test. So what I'm going to do is, I'm not going to remove this, I'm going to create a new test. So I'm just going to say it, and let's just say should be able to adopt an animal by page objects. Right. So to use the page object, what we need to do is actually import in the page object. So to do that, I'm just going to create a new variable, and I'm going to say var home underscore page, and I'm going to say that is equal to require, and then tell it where the page is. So in this case, we're going to go up a directory, and then it was inside page / homepage dot JS. This require is effectively an import, and what this does is this will import in this JavaScript file and assign this file to the value of home page in our test. So what we can now do is actually use this in our test. So we can now say home page dot, and what we want to do first is enter a value. So let's copy that, and then we can pass in a value. So let's just say you will subscribe, and close that. The next thing we said we want to do is get the text, so I'm going to say homepage, and this time I want to get the dynamic text. And let's go ahead and save this text to something. So get homepage text, and what I will do is do an expect on that. So I'm going to say expect get homepage text to be the same as this text here. And finally I'm going to say homepage dot click continue. Let's just quickly copy that. Fantastic. So what we've now done is effectively changed this part of the code to now use page objects. So what I'm going to do is run this test, but before I do that, I'm just going to put an X here. What that means is when you have an X in front of an it test, the X means to ignore that test. So if I have an X here, that now means that when it runs this test, it will see two tests, but it will only run one of them, i.e. this one, because this one doesn't have an X in front of it. So let's save that and run that and see what happens. Fantastic, that was quick. So you might have noticed that it said you will subscribe as opposed to I will subscribe, therefore indicating that it definitely did run this test. It definitely ran this one and not that one. But more importantly, because it was able to run this without any issues, i.e. here, that means our page object actually worked. So that's good news. That means that our page object concept is working, in that we're able to build a page object and then use it in our test. So now that we've done that, the next step was, after we click continue and we're on this page, what we want to do is able to select some item from the drop down and then again click the continue button. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's create another JavaScript file, and this time we are going to call it the animal page. So we're going to do the same thing as before. We're just going to say var animal page, function, model.exports as a new animal page. And in this page, what we're going to do is we first need the ability to select an item from this drop down, and the next method we need is the ability to click on this continue button. So the continue button is pretty much the same, really. Nothing's changed between the way it works in conceptual understanding. So we can just quite simply copy this, really, paste it in here, and this would behave the same way as the home page. The only difference this time is we now need to write code to be able to select something from this drop down. So let's inspect this and see if there's anything we can use. So this has a model of animal, so we can use that. And if we expand that, this then has various tags, or rather HTML tags, which all have values. So one thing we can do is we can first get this drop down by using the model identifier, and then we can try and find something by this value attribute via a CSS identifier. So let's do that. So what we're going to do is say this select animal is equal to function, and we're going to pass it some index value, and what we're going to say is element by model, and it was called animal, dot and then the $sign to invoke CSS on it. And so we said we'd use a value attribute, so that's a value which is equal to our index. So the index value needs to be inside double quotes, but because this is something we're passing in, then what we're going to do is put in a single quote, a plus sign, and do the same thing on the other end. And let's just clean this up a bit. Okay, and we will also need to click on it naturally. So what this is now doing is we're going to find the drop down first by model, and then we're going to click on a value, and the value we're going to click on is something we're going to pass in, and that's it really. So again, another straightforward page object to write, another page object which is representing a different page. Now before we start using this in our test, there's something that we've missed. See here, once we've clicked on the continue button, this just doesn't navigate to the page, but the page object also has to return us a reference to this particular page so that we can continue using this page object. One of the rules for page object pattern is when you click on something, or rather to be more specific, when we invoke a method, if the method is some kind of interaction which only resides on the page, i.e. entering some text or getting some text, then it doesn't really return anything. But if we click on a link that's supposed to navigate us away from the page and onto some other page which might have another page object, then it needs to return a reference to that page object. So how do we do that? Well, first of all, we click the continue button here. So this needs to return us a reference to the new page object. So what we need to say is return, and this time we're going to return a require, and we're going to return it a reference to the new page object we just created. So I'm just going to use the dot to say the current directory, and then I'm going to give the name of the class. So in this case it was animal page .js. This, when invoking the click continue method, will not only just click on the page, or rather the continue button, it will also return us a reference to this particular object. So when we use this analogy, i.e. we're trying to require, or rather return, another page object, we also need to import this into the page object. And the way we do that is quite simply writing a require up here as well. So we say require page, and then the name of the page. In this case it was animal page .js. So now if we go back to our test, what we can do is when we click on continue, we can save this as the animal page. And now that we've saved a reference to the animal page, when we click on the continue in our test, we can start using this as well. So we can say animal page dot select an animal. So let's say in this instance we're going to select 2, and then we can say animal page click continue. Okay, so let's save this and run this and see what happens. Fantastic, no issues. So we've gone more than halfway through now. So the last thing we said we'd do is once we click on this continue, we said that we would get this text on this page. Naturally, since this is now another page, this means we now need to write another page object. So this should become quite obvious now what we're going to do. So the first thing we're going to do is, before we write the page object, is let's just return a reference to the new page object. So we're going to return a require, and this is where we need to decide what we're going to call that page. So I'm going to call that page confirm page.js, So now I also need to import that page in. So if I now go ahead and create that page, so I'm going to say confirm underscore page.js, and let's just save everything. So what's going to happen now is when we click continue on the animal page, we're going to also return a reference to this confirm page, i.e. this page object. So let's go ahead and write this as well. And on the confirm page, like we said, the only thing we want to do is just get this. So let's just call this this.get title function, and since this is just going to return us something, we're just going to say return element by, well, let's find out what it is. So let's inspect this. So the easiest way to see is it's got an ID, it's got a class, and it's inside a h1 tag. And based on this hierarchy, h1 tag is the first thing that appears, so we'll use that. So we'll use css dot css by h1 dot get text. Okay, so now if we go back to our test, again we can do the same thing and save an instance to that. So we'll just say confirm page is equal to animal.click continue, because click continue returns a confirm page, so we can save that reference now. So in our test, what we can now just do is do an expect on it and just say confirm page dot get title to be thank you. Right, so let's save that and run that, and fingers crossed this should pass first time. Fantastic, it's passed. So what have we actually done? Well, let's look at this. Let's compare the two tests, in fact. So we've got this test here. Both tests do exactly the same thing. There is no difference in what the tests do. If you want to be really kind of specific about it, the only difference between the two tests is here I'm saying I will subscribe, and here I'm saying you will subscribe. It's important, this difference here. But that's the only subtle difference between the two. There is no logical difference between the tests. The tests are doing the same expects and they're doing the same steps. The only difference between the two tests is that one is not using page objects, whilst the other one is. So what are the advantages of using page objects? Well, let's just say I now want to write another test. Say I want to write another test about some other methods on this page. For instance, does this link exist? See, what I would need to do is, for the other test, is quite simply copy all of this, and what I would need to do is go inside this confirm page object and just add in another method. Another beauty is, let's just say we have maybe 100 different tests, and this continue button here, i.e. this continue button here, the text for this continue button changes to something else. Let's just say it changes to something like, as opposed to saying continue, it says confirm. If you have 100 different tests like this, what you will need to do is, in those 100 texts, you'd need to go in and find every reference you make to that continue button, in this case is here, and change it to confirm. Now that's incredibly time consuming, Because it logically is. If you have 100 different tests and you have this one line of code repeated 100 different times in 100 different tests, you will have to change it 100 different times. However, if you use a page object, i.e. here, and you are pretty much still doing the same thing, the advantage you now have is, say that continue text changes to confirm, the only place you'd need to go and change it is here. By changing it here, you change it everywhere else. Let's just have a look at another thing then. Let's just say when we click on this continue button doesn't take us to this animal page anymore. It takes us to another page somewhere else on the site. Again, if you have a lot of tests, you'd have to go in and manually change a lot of code in a lot of different tests. Again, exceptionally time consuming. If you have page objects, you only go in and change it in the one place, write a new page object for it, and then get the new page object to reference this page, and that would resolve the issue. So you see, writing page objects, although it doesn't necessarily make writing your test more quicker than had you write it here, maintaining the test becomes exponentially much more easier. Also, let's just say we have to write more tests. It's a lot easier to write tests like this than like that. See, if you have a look at this test, let's just read this from a reading perspective only. This is saying element by this, do this, get this, do that, do this, right? Get something by CSS, get something by binding, get something by model, do send keys, do a get text, so on. Someone will have to read this line by line to understand what is happening, and even then it's not very self-explanatory. Here, because we're using page objects and we're using meaningful descriptions for our function names, it makes sense. You can actually look at this, read this, and understand exactly what is happening. Also, another advantage to using page objects is it reduces code duplication. Let's just say I want to write this test again, but test something slightly differently. I will end up rewriting this code again and this code again. By doing page objects, although you are still repeating yourself, it's easier to maintain and it makes a little bit more sense, and the duplication rate actually reduces. For instance, the stuff you end up repeating, i.e. stuff like this, is vital because you need to have that information. But when we have information like this, i.e. actually interacting on an element, you can change that in your page object classes, and it just becomes that much more easier to manage. So this video has actually been quite a long video, and is given page objects is not a simple concept to understand and to explain by simply using an example. You have to show some code, and you've got to show some code which actually makes transitions from one page object to another. You've got to show code, I feel, with comparisons to show the advantages of not using page objects, or rather the disadvantages of not using page objects and the advantages of using page objects. So in this tutorial we've learnt a lot about page objects, and more specifically we've learnt how to write page objects for Protractor tests. And that's it for this video, folks. Thanks for watching. Hi guys, I really appreciate you watching my videos, and if you liked it, give it a thumbs up. If you already haven't, hit the subscribe button below to stay up to date with my latest videos, which I release every Wednesdays and Sundays. Also, follow me on Twitter, Facebook and Google. Links in the description below. Until next time, ciao.